Good morning. My name is Asad Lalji. Welcome to yet another session of Avid Online. A warm virtual welcome to all of you who are joining us for the first time. Please refer to the chat box for more information on Avid Learning, our partners, and our platform for this session. With the global pandemic, with much of the world around us took digital and began our online campaign, Avid Online, on the 1st of April 2020, with being almost 2 years young and having presented over 300 programs. We continue to stay true to our mantra that learning never stops. So whether we continue online or as the world is opening up around us, start to transition to physical events, we hope you will be with us in this journey of learning. Literature has been one of our most important and robust verticals, and we continue to present workshops, masterclasses to guide our audiences to achieve their literary goals. With that, I welcome you to today's session. Avid Learning, the Kalagora Association, Penguin Random House India present her story, The Art of Creating a Strong Female Protagonist, a creative writing masterclass conducted by award-winning author, journalist and speaker Meghna Pant. Known as one of India's best writers, she's a multiple award-winning author, feminist, speaker, journalist, columnist. She has written and published 8 books, including her latest page-turner, Boys Don't Cry, based on a true story, mostly. Boys Don't Cry is a gripping, compelling, and courageous novel that takes you behind the closed doors of a modern Indian marriage. To more about our speaker, please refer to her very impressive bio that has been posted in the chat section. This masterclass will guide budding authors and writers through the multi-dimensional approach of developing a strong lead female character without the usual stereotypes. This session will focus on finding your voice on the page and allowing stories to emerge naturally and creatively. You can use this approach while developing your characters across scripts of fiction, non-fiction, memoirs, poetry, theatre, short film, and cinema. Please note this session will last 45 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. Meghna will be taking questions. There are a few house rules that have been also posted in the chat box. Do take a look at them and follow them just to make sure we get the most out of this hour we have with Meghna. On that note, look forward to a fascinating session. Over to you, Meghna. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Asad, for that wonderful introduction, and to Avid Learning for having me back for another workshop. And of course, the Kalagura Festival and Penguin India that published my recent book, Boys Don't Cry, which is why we ended up with this lovely, lovely workshop on how we can build a strong female character. So thank you everybody for joining us here today. I believe we had over 150 signups, which is huge. So I'm going to keep it as crisp and take you quickly through our main highlights for this workshop. So we have a little bit of time to even take a couple of questions. So first of all, guys, a lot of you know that most of my work, who've been following my work, know that a lot of my work from my debut novel, 1.5 Wife, to most recently Boys Don't Cry, have been inspired by strong female leads. So, which is why I thought it would be an interesting workshop to discuss, because now even whether it's on film, whether it's in web series, whether it's in literature, the powerful female lead has come into the mainstream. She's captured public imagination like never before, especially in our country. So it's nice, if you're a writer, if you're a creative person, it's nice to understand how the entire process works. So in this workshop, I'm going to be talking about how, the approach that you can take to build characteristics for a female lead, how you can create a backstory, how you can develop a support system for the character, and examples of strong female characters that you can refer to. Okay, so the part 1, we're going to talk about how you can build strong female characters. Okay, so let's begin with how, what are the characteristics for a strong, interesting, multifaceted female lead. Now, first of all, the one question that a lot of new writers ask is, Meghna, what is a protagonist to begin with? The most common definition, of course, of a protagonist is a leading character, to keep it very simple, whether it's in a movie, in drama, or literary work. Nowhere does it say that the main character has a gender or an inclination towards being, good or bad, or any of those, stereotypes or boxes that we place people into, or labels that we put assign on people. So strong characters come in all shapes, all sizes and genders. So protagonist is basically simply a character around whom the story revolves and then evolves. Now, over the years, we've witnessed a rise in strong female leads, whether it's in movies, novels, web series, and comics as well. But every creator has a pretty different idea of how strength is expressed and should be perceived by the audience. So, if you're a writer, there are a few ways to ensure that your audience understands the type of character that you've created when your focus is on writing a strong female character. Um, Now, a lot of, especially in literature now, if you're seeing, there are a lot more female authors as compared to before. There are a lot of more stories now with strong female characters, which are bringing women's perspectives into getting published. But unfortunately, the larger trend within writing still belies a lot of emancipation. So, as gender stereotypes are still, as we know, especially in our country, they remain pervasive. So, for example, you find that a lot of prototype male protagonists will be, these rich, handsome, say, a scientist who saves the world, right? Whereas a female will be like this, this sort of like a sidekick. She'll be this delicate, submissive beauty who works perhaps in a non-threatening job, like a kindergarten teacher, and just sort of simpers along. So strong female characters, as they're portrayed, whether it's in cinema or even with books today, unfortunately fall into the typical sort of labeling, that we see in society. They're either bitches or they're whores or they're unlovable or they're unstable, or they're women who are ultimately taught a lesson and put in their place. So the male experience is unfortunately still considered weightier than the female experience. And a woman, and this is, guys, even within the confines of our imagination, she must not defile society's creation of this sort of Sati Savitri Ablanari. So I'll give you an example, like a female writer, even of Arundhati Roy's caliber, for example. When her books come out, she'll be judged for her looks, her clothes, her lipstick color, her hairstyle, her shoes, before she's even judged for her writing. A male writer will never face such blatant objectification, right? But I'll circle back to this issue later because I can go on and on about it. For now, let's focus on how you can build a female character, okay? For that, let's first understand, how do you even build a character? Okay, so here goes. Let's dive into that first. Now, think back for a moment and try to remember the stories that you most love, right? If you think carefully, you'll recall that each of these stories have a character who moved you in some way. Some of these characters have even been created, 200 years ago, like Mr. Darcy, who remains a pin-up man for women even today. These characters occupy a world that you've never inhabited, right? Like, say, Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird, who lived in the deep south of America a century ago. These are not lives that we've lived or can even associate with, but these are still characters who stand out for us very strongly. So, as a reader, you know these characters as you would know a good friend. And that's why, because you relate to these characters, because you care about them, because you're invested in their life, you remember them. So you think of Mowgli, you think of Harry Potter, you think of Esther Rahel from God of Small Things, or Mohan Biswas, or Jane Eyre, Salim Sinai, Swami, right? We all grew up watching Swami and his antics, or Agastya Sen, right? So these are the characters who were authentic, they were genuine, more than anything else, they were relatable. They were either believable because they behaved like real people, or they were the people who you want people to be like, right? As a reader. So, what really worked for them is this character building, and that is important both in fiction and in nonfiction. So, when you write any character, whether it's a male or a female, you must do it so plausibly that you yourself begin to believe that your characters actually exist. So, for example, my first novel, One and a Half Wife, right? The characters that I created there, Amara, BG, Baba, Ria, Lalit, I feel like till today, I feel like they're actually out there somewhere. They're living their lives in sort of almost a parallel realm. So you must, when you're creating characters, think of that they must become your best friends. They must be people that you know very intimately and very well. And if they're relatable to you as a writer, then they'll also be relatable to your readers. Now, if you're talking particularly, and let's get now to a little more focus on the differentiation between male and female characters. And there are three ways in which you can highlight it. First is, of course, the plot. Very obvious, women, of course, lead different lives than men by making the same choices and despite having the same experiences. Their life story will be very different, right? If a man were to live my life, it would turn out very differently for him, right? Just because of his gender. The other thing that captures differentiation is through dialogue, because men and women speak very differently. And if you're a writer, you must pay keen attention to how people talk to one another, whether it's in real life or whether it's through your fiction. And you must create a character backstory, because that really will bring out a lot of differentiation. Now, let me first start by talking about how to write female characters through dialogues. Okay, so I'll give you all an example and you can actually chime in at this point. I'll tell you two statements and you tell me whether you think a man has written it or said it, sorry, or a woman has said it, okay? So these are the two statements. I'm sorry we're late. We had a flat tire on our way here. Versus, the tire blew when we hit 70 on the freeway. Now, can anyone tell me which one you think the first line was said by? Was it said by a woman or a man? You can unmute yourself if you're allowed. Are they allowed to, guys?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
First one, woman.
Yeah. And the second one, guys.
The second one, man.
Right?
Mhm.
Because why do you can make out just through dialogue, right? The stylistic differences between these two statements will tell you right away which gender is talking in each one, right? So everybody has their tell. Every character has their tell. We're inclined to use certain words, like women will use the word gorgeous a lot. For example, to describe just about anything, whereas men will probably use the word gorgeous just to describe a woman, right? So these are small stylistic differences that you must note in your real life, which you obviously have, and then also put it into your fiction. Because if your dialogue can tell whether it's a female or a male speaking, then you know that you don't have to bring it out through a lot of other differentiations. If your intended character is female, make sure to include also plenty of personal pronouns. For example, I, you, we, and a lot of descriptive terms, because that's just how women generally tend to talk. If your intended audience is male, on the other hand, then you must trade in these pronouns like I, you, we for articles such as the, that, and choose more active verbs. You limit your adjectives and you include more concrete figures like numbers, because that's just generally, if you notice conversations, if you go to a party next time, notice how the men will talk to each other or even to other women versus how women will converse, and pick up on that, because then it'll sound authentic. If your dialogues are sounding authentic and come across as the way people actually talk in real life, then chances are that your female character will also be more relatable and more authentic, and that really works out well for everybody in the end. For both the reader, it's a great reading experience. And for you as a writer, it's a skill you have. By the way, dialogue writing is considered a skill that very, very few writers have got right. So focus on that. Like I said, women are three more times likely to use words like gorgeous, whereas men will generally prefer to see something accomplished. Like a battle that's been won, a dog that's been trained, or a disease that's been conquered. So they're more focused when they're talking in everyday lingo. They'll be more focused on what has come out of their daily activity, whereas women will be more emotive. Women are also more likely to state preferences rather than make demands. So I would like a glass of wine, for example, right? Or women will tend to start a sentence with a question. So, hey, what do you think about, XYZ? Women also tend to use apologetic language, even when they're being decisive. And this really breaks my heart to be even saying things like that. But unfortunately, these are the gender normative, everyday realities that we see. And unfortunately, it comes through in literature. And that's how you bring that sort of depth to your character, by making her use everyday language that women generally tend to use. So women will use apologetic language such as, I'm so sorry, but I'm going to have to lay you off. A man would never say that. A man will be like, you got to go, man. Men, on the other hand, will use more commanding and aggressive language. They'll say, grab me a beer. Whereas a woman would say, can you please get that beer for me? Men are also more likely to pepper everyday conversation with less accommodating phrasing, right? It can also include things like sarcasm or put downs or reference to taboo kind of, body parts, think of Donald Trump or whatever. But unfortunately, men do converse like that, especially when they think nowadays that they're not being observed. So be real about how men and women talk, observe it. And also remember these small points, like the ones I just mentioned. Also remember things like men will not divulge much of their personal information in everyday conversation, while women tend to frequently do that. So these small tricks of the trade will really help you bring out the differentiation between male and female characters using dialogue. Okay, so please keep these small tips in mind. The next point now is how to write female characters through plot. Okay, I don't know how many of you seen the movie As Good as It Gets, and I love that movie. And I think of Jack Nicholson's. I don't know if you remember, he played a writer in that movie, and somebody in that movie asked him, how do you write women so well? And he says, this line just gets to me every time. He says, I think of a man and I take away reason and accountability. So he actually says this in the movie. It's ugh, right? But this is just unfortunately the way people think, or used to think like 15 years back. So let's talk about the plot, right? The plot is a character basically in action. What the character is doing. That is basically what a plot means in a novel. So many writers have a very clear idea of the plot down to the last detail before they begin writing their book. So one tip I'll give you as a writer is always have a little synopsis with a breakdown of each chapter before you begin writing your novel or even your short story collection or even your non-fiction. Always, I know it takes a lot of effort and time, but always have a synopsis in place, because when I wrote 1.5 Wives, I didn't have a synopsis in place, and I kind of got stuck midway through the book, and I had to it took me a lot of time. It took me almost 3 months to be able to write the second half of the book. So I learned a lesson there, and now for say Boyzone Prior, The Terrible, Horrible, Very Bad, Good News, I write the synopsis before I begin writing, and then I know exactly where I'm going with my story. So it really eases out all the kinks and all the tumbles that you will face as a writer along the way. So keep your life simple, invest in that synopsis. Of course, a lot of other writers start to write their book with just like an idea of the plot. And I have to be honest, I've started writing screenplays now, and 2 of them have been picked up to be made into movies. Even Boys Don't Cry has been picked up to be made into a movie. And one of the screenplays was literally based on one line that I got stuck on, this one image I had in my mind and just couldn't shake off. So that was the sort of origin story of that screenplay. So it really depends on how you function as a creative person. Some people are very disciplined. They'll write 500 words a day, no matter what. Some will kind of, not write for months and then suddenly write in a fury for 2-3 months and be done with the same amount of work. So find what works for you as per your lifestyle, as per your personality, but keep creating. So a lot of people begin with the opening line and they allow the interaction of the characters to lead them to a logical movement of events. So plot is basically a logical movement of events, right? And they let the story grow. They allow the plot to take shape from an organic situation. So you take your character and you put them in a certain situation, you throw conflicts at them, and according to the character's socioeconomic background, according to their personality, according to their environment, they'll react to those situations that are thrown at them and react to the conflicts that are thrown at them. So remember, it doesn't matter how you begin to write the story, just keep in mind that every narrative is made up of a sequence of events that have to move in a logical and convincing order. And once you've nailed that, then your story is going to come together very beautifully, right? Now, stories, of course, it's a procedural, right? It's a priority. But what does it mean then? How does gender come into all that, right? Because, this is where you must focus back on what this workshop is about. That how do you say, for example, write about or write from a male perspective? What does that even mean, right? Some of you must be like, what does this even mean, all of this? When you're writing from a male protagonist perspective, what do? Do you take out sentimentality? Do you make your character more ruthless? Do you write kind of spare prose? Do you sacrifice description to the plot? That means you don't use very descriptive terms, but you focus just on the actions to keep the narrative flowing forward. So a lot of writers have given this tip that you must reverse these sort of stereotypes for female characters. So, for example, women will often favor a focus on relationships and emotions behind the story, right? So, if it's a war story and you're writing from a female point of view, she will be more interested in what is happening to the family that has been left at home while the spouse is, say, off fighting the war, right? But if you're writing that same story from a man's point of view, or a male protagonist, the central character being a man, his focus will be, or tend to favor at least, what happens at the war. So now your entire storyline has changed because you've changed the gender of your character. And that's why it's very important to understand how all of this works. Now, this is a very naive kind of thing to say, but a lot of writers hesitate to create main women protagonists, assuming that they have a lack of range in subject matter, or even emotional tone, or they even lack, say, a sense of humor. Like, it's very difficult for me also as a female writer to write and showcase a woman with a sense of humor, because for some people reason, as a society, we assume that women, especially in India, I found this, and it's very interesting. Women are pushed back a lot when they try to be funny. Like, I remember meeting Twinkle Khanna, and she told me the same thing, that she writes humor, but there's no other female author we can think of today who's actually doing that in India. And I don't know what this sort of societal this stereotyping, and that women don't have a sense of humor. It's something that must be studied very keenly. And a lot of people also assume that they don't want to write about a female perspective or a male female perspective because it'll be limited to the sort of embroidering of trivial themes, like a concern with the mere surfaces of life, right? But you as a writer, the beauty of living in the 21st century is that, and of being a writer, is that you can transcend all that. You don't have to succumb to stereotypes or, go with what everybody has done before you. So nowadays, if you look around, of course, things have changed. Women are portrayed as chance takers. They've defiantly resisted social and familiar norms in a very conservative Indian society. Because remember, we are, of course, most of us are from Mumbai. We live in a very sort of different, India than the rest of India. So we still have a very conservative society. So keep all that in mind. Focus on your character development. Your main character, especially, make her lively, make her imperfect. Look at your own lives. Are any of you perfect human beings? Am I a perfect human being? God, no. And I hope I'm never perfect. I hope I keep falling and failing and making mistakes, because that's part of the human experience. We're all fundamentally flawed human beings. And that's what makes us realistic. That's what makes us human. Let your character be exactly like that. Let her do contradictory things. Like, for example, a school teacher who hates kids, right? Isn't that interesting? Because you don't expect that from a school teacher, right? Your character, of course, can have one or two stereotypical characteristics. For example, like a stingy Gujarati, or say a loud Punjabi. But they can also be an individual at the same time, and a complex person who's developing and growing, just like the rest of us are, just exactly like us. So think of, say, Railway Raju from The Guide, who's, why The Guide works so well is, for example, because it's a tour guide, a corrupt tour guide who becomes a holy man. It's so interesting because he's at the start of his journey, he's someone else, and by the end of it, captured in the book and the movie, he's completely a different person. And that radicalization of someone's life is what your story should be all about. Basically, your plot is a character in action. The character's, snippet of his life story or her life story captured in that limited, medium. So your story will be real only if your character is real. And of course, don't use genre as an excuse to exclude a strong main character. A lot of people say that if I'm writing fantasy or if I'm writing horror, then what's the point of having a strong character development? Even books about vampires, please remember, they have a Bella, right? Even books about wizards have a Harry Potter. All good books have good characters. And if you're writing female characters, make sure they're strongly developed, and you can use them to break all these tropes that have been assigned to female characters so far in literature, in film, in web series also. Go ahead and shatter the stereotypes, take the conversation forward. I mean, literature is the best way to do it. Writing is the best way to do it. One small segue I'll do over here is to understand how Indian marketing, Indian readership in particular works, how Indian book marketing in particular works. We all know that readers will care about your novel only when they care about your characters, right? They will not read your novel because they want the world to be safe, right? They will read your novel because they want your protagonist to save the world. I'm going to repeat that again so it really sinks in. Nobody's going to read your book because they want the world to be saved. They will read your book because they want your main protagonist, your main character, to save the world. So make your character very interesting, very dynamic, and a very relatable, fundamentally flawed human being who speaks like the rest of us, who acts in situations like the rest of us, who is someone everyone can identify with. You find that a lot of biopics work well, whether it's on celluloid or in literature and books. A lot of true life stories work very well because they're real people, and that's one thing you must always remember and keep in mind. The one thing about readership you have to understand in India, at least, is that most of the best-selling authors are mostly male. There are also very few women or female reviewers, book reviewers, and this is despite the fact that, by the way, our readership is 60% female and 40% male. So what happens is female readers will tend to read 50% women books by women and 50% books written by men. Whereas the male reader will read 70% of books written by men and 30% by women. So even in readership habits, you find a lot of biases, gender biases creeping in. There are also a lot of other biases that exist in readership, is that women will tend to read almost 80% of all literary fiction that comes out, and most of the self-help books, right? But men will tend to read more books such as history, science fiction, and with themes of politics in them. So keep these small things in mind when you're also writing your book or deciding what genre you're going to be focusing on. So I'm halfway through the workshop, and any questions you guys have, please feel free to jot them down and ask away. I think we should be able to cover this. I should be done in 10-15 minutes, and then I think I'll have enough time to take your questions. Now, this takes me to part 2 of our workshop, which is creating a backstory. What is a character backstory? And why is it important to give your character a backstory? So by the way, any good writer will always have a fully developed, almost synopsis, thesis on their main character, especially. All of these elements, all of these small things will not necessarily come through in the novel, but they'll exist in the background. So for example, why do we care about Dexter, right? I don't know how many of you watched that show. He's a blood splatter analyst who kills people, right? In the book by Jeff Lindsay and also in the show. But why do we care about someone who's murdering people? Why do we empathize with him despite the fact that he murders people as a hobby? Because Dexter has a heart-wrenching backstory, right? So we don't think of him as a criminal, despite the fact that technically in legal terms, he is a criminal. He's murdering people, for God's sake. But we think of him as a crusader, right? It's the same thing that if a person from the army kills someone in battle, is it the same thing as somebody who just goes and puts a knife in someone's back just like that because he felt like. So you have to give your character a backstory just to make people relate to him. How do you go about building a backstory? The first thing you have to do is a character interview, right? So talk to your character the way you talk to, say, your best friend, okay? And jot down all her life elements. So I'll give you some tips which you can write down of how to interview a character. First of all, you have to know or think about, where does your character live? Secondly, in what era does she live? Does she live in the modern world? Does she live in the 18th century? Then, third, what is her occupation? So where does she live? What era does she live in? What is her occupation? What does she do? Does she work? Is she a housemaker? Or does she have some hobbies? All of that. Then, fourth thing, what is her personality like, right? The fifth thing, what does she look like? What is her age? What is her background? Like who's part of her family? Who are her friends? Who are her close friends? Who are her enemies? Who are people she doesn't like? What is her education like? What is her socioeconomic status like? What has her upbringing been like? And I know this sounds like a lot of work, but once you finish this character interview, your character will be more fleshed out. And once a character, especially your main character, is fleshed out, when you're writing that logical sequence of events we just spoke about, which is the plot, if your character is well etched out, the flow of that plot will be effortless. So spend some time and focus on these things. What is your character's motivation? Now, this is extremely important because it establishes the entire tone of the book. What is it that she wants from life? Because right at the start of your book, you've established some sort of goal that she has to accomplish by the end of the book, right? So what is it? What is inspiring her? What is motivating her? What is pushing her forward to achieve those goals or that particular goal, despite all the hurdles that you're going to throw at her through the course of the novel? How do other people react to her? This is very interesting because this also comes in terms with her personality, right? A lot of us live in denial of even who we are as people, right? We're very shocked when somebody doesn't like us. And then we start seeing patterns and realizing that it may not be that person, it may be me. This might be something that I'm doing wrong to antagonize other people. So, what is it that your character is doing right or wrong in the public domain? So, how are other people reacting to her? Is she a very pleasant person? Does she come across as abrasive? Now, I don't know how many of you watched Decoupled, or which is a basically like a sort of Indian version of Curb Your Enthusiasm. The guy is not sort of, he's gruff, right? And then people around him react accordingly, and because of that one personality trait, his entire life story shifts and forms shape. So it's a very interesting character to write. So think about that. That how are people around her reacting to her? Because that'll really add depth to your story and to your character. And what is at stake for her? This ties in with what is her motivation, because the risk of failure has to be very big for anybody to be interested in your story. Because if the character has no hurdles, no conflict, if her life is fabulous to begin with, then what is the motivation for the reader to move forward? They'll be like, "Acha, ek chapter mein to khatam ho gaya. She has a great life, then what am I looking forward to reading?" So put a lot of hurdles in your protagonist's life and establish what is at stake for her. What is she going to lose if she doesn't go through with accomplishing her goals? Also, one thing very important is, what are her weaknesses? Now, in every conflict towards the end of the novel, when the final resolution is happening, your character's main weakness has to come back and pull her down further. When all hope is lost, that last bit of the novel, when things are coming together and suddenly they're pulled away. So this is when you take the character's weakness and use it against her. Okay. So it can be very, very simple things like she loves chocolates, for example, and for some reason eating chocolates is going to, prove to be a hurdle to her right towards the end, just when everything is falling in place. It can be something very simple. It doesn't have to be anything high-fi. So think of it, if once you know your character well, think of her against a normal, a human being, the way we all are. We all have our weaknesses and strengths. So see what works for her. Now, this interview is going to be a way for you to familiarize yourself with the character. And again, like I said, most of this information will not make its way directly into the book, but what it will do is to strengthen your story. Okay. And I've been mentioning a lot of conflict. Now, character conflict is very important to add depth to your character. Now, the first act of your story, you have to give your character an occasion to rise to, right? Like a goal, a hurdle, whatever it is. Something that, first of all, let the readers get to know her, while it'll also reveal something about her. Okay, it'll show the reader immediately what kind of person she is. So your character has to struggle. She has to fight some odds, whether it's internal, like she has a personality issue, like we spoke about in Decouple. The main person, the male protagonist, has personality issues that are leading to him into difficult situations, or it has to be some conflict from the outside. That, like in Boyzone Cry, my female protagonist Manika, her husband is hitting her. So, that's an external thing, which also ties into a personality internally, because she's not able to fight back, at least initially. So, your character has to keep struggling, because that's the only way she'll move forward. In the second act, okay, the reader must be so invested in your character's journey, even as the character is coming to a new understanding of the conflict or the conflicts that she's facing. So this conflict has to be the foundation for the rest of your book. And you don't have to keep it to one conflict. You can keep it to multiple, or you can also focus on one. You decide. That's up to you as a creative person. But there has to be a wall that your character has to break. And by the end of the novel, she has to have undertaken some sort of responsibility and a personal growth journey. So you can't have a monotone, right? You can't have like, uski life could change in your like, whatever the beginning, whatever she was like at the beginning of the novel is what she's like at the end of the novel. And again, this can apply to short stories as well. Short stories are very exciting. I've written Happy Birthday, The Trouble with Women, two of my short story collections, which have, especially the first one, Happy Birthday, was received very well. For this reason, that within a short snippet of 7 to 8 pages or 20 pages or whatever the short story's length is, you've made the character undergo such a strong, intense, dramatic journey in a matter of like just a few pages that she's not the same person she was when she started out. In a novel, you have a larger canvas to work with. So go ahead and throw multiple hurdles at your protagonist and let her jump over them. Let her find new ways, and of course, keep in mind all these things that you already know about her, and say, is she going to react like that? And don't let your personal biases come in. So if I'm writing, for example, Amara was the main protagonist of One and a Half Wife. She was a very shy, submissive girl. And I'm not like that in real life. So for me, it was literally like role playing. I had to imagine what a shy person would do in certain situations. And therefore, her story was believable because she reacted the way her personality, someone of her personality would. So keep it real, keep it authentic, and let the reader see the character fight back. Let the reader see how she's resolving her conflicts. Think of, say, someone like Anne Frank. Okay. Now, this brings us to part 3 of how you can develop a support system for the character. Now, I'm going to quickly talk about supporting characters, right? Now, we've been discussing the central character. This means, that's the character story that's driving the book. But who are these other characters, right? Now, the protagonist is the main character of your book, right? For example, the hero or the heroine, if you may, who will drive everything forward in the book. The antagonist is a villain who will oppose everything that the protagonist does. Okay, and again, it doesn't have to be black and white. All of us are shades of gray. Please make your protagonist also an interesting person by giving them shades of gray. This whole thing that it's she's going to be a perfect little thing, and the antagonist or the villain will be this imperfect, horrible person. That's very 1980s. Now everybody's a shade of gray, but we're just kind of what moves the conversation forward, moves the plot forward is how two people, if you put any two people in a room, there will be some conflict, right? It's not that both of them are bad or one of them is very good and the other one is evil. There's those kind of, those stereotypes don't exist anymore. We can't put people into such boxes. So make your characters also like that, right? Your villain doesn't have to be necessarily evil. It just has to be somebody who's opposing what the protagonist is doing in as defined by the plot of your book. Now, apart from the central character, you'll have many supporting characters. They'll not occupy the primary storyline, but they'll add depth to the protagonist to reflect what it is that she needs, like a best friend or a doctor or a teacher, whatever it is, her mother or mother-in-law, whatever the side characters are. One quick tip here is to always introduce your main character before page 10 of the book, of the novel, because a premise of the novel will buy your reader's interest for about 30 pages, but after that, it's your protagonist who's going to take the book forward. This brings me to a very interesting point that a lot of people overlook, which is a character name. Now, the name of the character is going to define your story. So your character must have an appropriate name, and this name should contextualize her personality, what is her setting, and what is her story. For example, when I was growing up, every second girl was called my name, Meghna, Neha, or Pooja. Nowadays, you see everybody's a Kiara or Kyra, or like even my daughter's name, Amara. Like there's a lot of Ara. So, if you think of Amara in 1980s, it will not work. Nowadays, if you think of a Pooja in 2022, it will also not work. So, your name, character name has to be contextualized with regard to what era she lives in. Think of, say, like a great character like Howard Rock, right? From The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. Now, his name contains both the words hard as well as roar. And what does his name do? It underlines the steely character that he is. So the character names can connote many things. It can connote their personality, their ethnic background, the period in which they live, and even who they will become. Right? If you name your protagonist Ganja, then don't be surprised if the reader expects him to be a druggie, right? Something as simple as that. And if you give your character silly monikers like calling the bad guy Raman or calling the good guy Ram, it will make them very caricaturish. So the etymology of character names is something you must pay very careful attention to. For example, I just mentioned Ravan, and Raman means a loud whale. So, these are things you don't know. So the writer was very smart when coming up with these names, and they have been. So think of, say, Harry Potter, right? Severus Snape, right? So, and this name translates into severe in Latin, and that kind of sums up the character's temperament. Or Draco translates to a terrifying beast that spits fire. Or Malfoy translates to bad faith. So these are what these names mean in Latin. So they characterize the characters who were written. So clearly one of the authors who's given us very unforgettable character names is J.K. Rowling. who's a female author, of course, and therefore my bias creeps in and I say she's amazing. But if you use sort of alliterative initials will call attention to the character. For example, Severus Snape or Bilbo Baggins, right? So be careful of giving your characters similar sounding names. So readers, what they do is when you're reading a book, you're not going to typically read past the initial of a name, right? So if you have Meera, Meena, Meeta, back to back, if you have three characters with those names, your reader is going to get confused because they're only going to read M-I, 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 right? So don't fall for that. And your, like I said, your character's name has to correspond to the era in which they live. So if you name a female character Padmavati, for example, which is from 2022, it will seem very out of context. So if you're really stuck with naming your characters, which is, trust me, a very common problem, check baby name books or go to Facebook. I go to Facebook, and whenever I'm writing a new story, I need like at least 20 character names. So I just go to Facebook and whoever's name pops up first, I'll just kind of, if I feel like it's contextualized and works well within the realm of the book, I'll throw their names in. So, don't be surprised if you see your names thrown in there. So also pay careful attention to the names of people you meet because you'll be very pleasantly surprised. So for my next book, I'm using two sisters I met in Coorg last year, whose names are very cute. And it's a young adult novel, and somehow I'm writing about two sisters, and those names were so cute together as sisters. So I'm using that. So pay attention to things like that because you never know where inspiration is going to strike you. One very strong thing I have to mention is that at no point must you spoon feed or rescue your character, because this is very lazy, gimmicky writing. Your main character in particular has to face failures and setbacks. Her struggles, her victories have to be intrinsic to the plot. She has to earn her ending. Whether it's a happy ending or not, she has to earn it. She has to deserve it. As feminists, sometimes we're subconsciously kind of saving women, whether it's in our head, whether it's in our tweets, whether it's in our daily lives. But in fiction, let the character do this by herself. Let her get helped by her personality, her supporting cast, her goal, her motive, and using her own agency, drawing into her own experiences. So think of her as your best friend, right? You have her best intentions in mind, but you can't control what she does unless she chooses to do it. So keep that in mind. Think of your character as your best friend. Like you can't force your friend, say she loves sweets, but she's diabetic. You can't force her to give up sweets, but you can tell her it's not good for you, right? So that's what the role of a narrator is, that you can't force somebody into doing something they can't. So if you have to rescue your lead, that means that there's something wrong with your story. Your story is flawed. So keep that in mind. This brings us to the last bit of our workshop, which is examples of strong female characters. I had to actually think about this very carefully and even research this because the public recollection of strong female characters is unfortunately quite limited. When I researched it, then of course it came out very effortlessly, but this shows that there is some obviously flaw in the way we are writing literature or reading literature. So that's something to think about. But of course, Scarlett O'Hara from Gone with the Wind or Jo March from Little Women are two examples that come immediately to mind. You got Lizzie Bennet from Pride and Prejudice, or say Nancy Drew, or Christy Thomas from the Babysitters Club series. You got Matilda by Roald Dahl, which is interestingly a man. But you've also got Hermione, right, from Harry Potter, who's written by a woman. You got Lisbeth Salander with The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and Helen Keller, of course. You've got, even in mythology, you've got the goddess Athena, for example, in Greek mythology. But you've got all kinds of examples of women who've been written very well and who've captivated readers for centuries, right? In Indian literature, unfortunately, we'll remember maybe, Salim Sinai from, say, Midnight's Children. But we'll rarely think of strong female characters. Like, you'll remember Rahel from God of Small Things. So that's something really to think about. But at the same time, I think there's this criticism that very few men can write female characters who are complex and who have stories of their own. But I feel like this is a pretty fallacious fallacy because, for example, Anna Karenina, right, was written by Tolstoy, or Flaubert wrote Madame Bovary, or Memoirs of Acacia were written by Arthur Golden, or Lady Chatterley's Lover, which is a classic, was written by D.H. Lawrence. And of course, if you think of India, who wrote Draupadi, the best female character we've ever had, right? She's from the Mahabharata. It was written by Vyas, a man. Sita from Ramayana was written by Valmiki, also a man. So these are strong female characters who immediately come to our mind from our own Indian literature, right? Paro from Devdas, for example, was written by a man. Charulata by Rabindranath Tagore, Umrao Jan, for example, or even Bankim Chandra's Raja Mohan's wife, or I mentioned Guide earlier, R.K. Narayan's Rosie in Guide was also, she was, an interesting person. Or say, talking about Tagore, even Vinodini in Chokar Bali, she's a woman who exercises the agency and is a fundamentally, again, flawed person. And that's what makes her interesting. So in modern India, I think it's, the books that I found interesting are, say, Jasoda by Kiran Nagarkar, or The Mysterious Ailment of Ruby Basti by Hansa Shekhar, or one of my favorite writers, Jerry Pinto. He wrote M and the Big Home, where the main protagonist was his mother. And, and these stories really brought out, how women are ruling the roost. Or say He from Heer Ranja, like in folklore, so it doesn't have to be limited to just literature and books. Uh, but of course, women also, we're talking about whether men can write women well, but women also write men very well. And the most popular example, of course, is J.K. Rowling. She's writing from a male point of view with Harry Potter. You've also seen, say, someone like Hilary Mantel, who's won 2 Bookers for writing about a male protagonist, Thomas Cromwell, and all his adventures. Or say, our favorite in India, Jhumpa Lahiri, right? Her characters have always sort of, her point of view has always been a little androgynous, right? So the reason a lot of women find it easier is, it's said, is because, our whole lives have been spent reading vast amounts of literature written by men. Of course, that's hopefully changing and we're getting better at it. But I also feel like the books may be slightly different in nature because of different experiences, but gender has nothing to do with quality. There is some terrible female writing, there's some terrible male writing, some badly written male characters by women, some badly written female characters by male authors. For example, E.L. James, right? She wrote 50 Shades of Grey. And I think she's done a great disservice to women everywhere by her portrayal of this insipid, simpering female lead with all these tropes and all these stereotypes thrown in. Don't even get me started on Game of Thrones because I love the show so much. But the end with the Khaleesi, I think she was given the worst ending of any strong female character, right? She was turned from a woman of power and inspiration to a woman of madness. And this is the same thing I spoke about earlier, that women in power have a price to pay, right? And that Game of Thrones end really tied into all those horrible stereotypes that the show had initially set out to break. So the most disappointing, like, these are bad ends. But we also have, Begum Jaan by Isma Chugtai, who's a female writer. And, her story is about not finding bliss or happiness in her marriage. So she takes control of her sexuality and refuses to be bothered by other people's opinion. Or even in Lihaf, by the same author, she speaks about homosexuality back in the 1940s, right? That in a language like Urdu. And she was even tried in the Lahore court for that. Or even contemporary writers like Chitra Banerjee Deva Karuri, whose Palace of Illusion is a must-read for you as a reader and as a writer, because she captured Draupadi so well in a light that nobody else has. So if you're a female writer, guys, I'm going to wrap up now. Writing in a male voice is a challenge because it requires us writing outside of our direct experiences, but it's not impossible. For example, in Happy Birthday, I've written 6 of the 13 stories in male voices. I've written another book on war between China and India, and these are all considered domains of male writers. But I think you shouldn't be navel gazing if you're a writer. You should write about something that takes you into another world, which will also then take your reader into an unknown world, right? So let's not get called out for letting our biases show, especially in this day and age, or being ignorant. And I think that's something that you really have to focus on, and take it forward. And I'll give you certain pop culture references, like Mother India, Sophie's Choice, Earth, Mirch Masala, Kahani, back in the old days. Even today, we've got amazing movies like Dangal, Padmavat, Tanuvets Manu, Razi, Piku, Tumhari Sulu, Kahani, all these films that captured popular culture, female leads so well, like Mary Kom also, for example. And today we're finding that even in Bollywood, female stars are delivering the biggest hits. Since the last, I think, since 2016-17, and it's an indicator of change for women and for female characters, not just in literature, but also in the film business. So I hope all of this helps you guys. Remember to be a lotus in spite of the swamp. We all are. And pay it forward. You've got a workshop by a female writer. Please keep buying books written by women, it's very important that we keep taking the conversation forward. So any questions, let me know. We have around 10 minutes, I think.
Thank you. It was a very interesting workshop, and my question was very this like for familiarity of characters, we do, like you also said, write down one or two stereotypes, right? We do have that kind of thing. Versus if we have to break the mold to write strong female characters, which are not really very prevalent. So, what's really the balance that we have to keep in mind? Because like you also said, like sometimes in genre fiction, for example, we do there are certain tropes and things we do include just for the sake of it. So how do you maintain that fine balance in that sense, or any example that you think has had that balance maintained very well?
I'll give you the example of, say, Draupadi versus Sita, right? Who do you think is the more popular character amongst the two? Like, just think about it. Like, who would you say is more popular character between Draupadi and Sita?
Probably Sita is more mainstream. I mean, in that sense, versus
Draupadi.
Yeah.
But weren't they very different characters? Like Draupadi was sort of, her flaws were very on the surface, right? Whereas Sita was like sort of perfect, right? Like a perfect person. Draupadi was not. So I think if you're trying to capture, what I'm trying to say is that even though Sita was a much more compliant character written than Draupadi was, both of them captured the public imagination because they acted within this world, that mini world that was created for them. They acted in accordance with their backstory, with their upbringing, with their personality, with their supporting characters. So it's not just about the main character, it's also about the world, the mini world, the micro world that you're creating for them, and whether they react authentically in these situations. So I think that's something that you need to think about. And for example, in Boyzone Crime, a new book, the character is a strong, independent, modern woman, but she doesn't know how to stand up for herself when she's abused because society never had that conversation with her. That how do you identify abuse? How do you stand up for yourself? How do you fight back? How do you leave a marriage? We keep talking about how to fall in love, but we never talk about how to fall out of love, right? As a society. So, these are the lessons that she has to learn. So she goes from she's a fiery girl, she becomes submissive, and then she sort of gets her fire back, right? And she gets her revenge. And how? So you can once you do the character interview and you understand how your character works, and you start walking with her and thinking of her as your best friend, these things would kind of answer themselves. But again, please keep it very real, keep it very authentic. When your readers are very smart. So if they feel shortchanged, they'll immediately not stop identifying with the book. And then the book will not do well, the story will suffer. So whatever you create for your character, the mini world you create for them, let the character act in accordance with that mini world and in accordance with the conflicts. And she'll work within her, weaknesses, within her strengths. So identify those parameters. That how would my character react if suppose, a man Eve teases on the road? Certain girls would, run the other way. Certain girls would like go and Eve tease the guy back. So all those, but the only thing that remains the same is it has to sound authentic. It has to sound real.
Sunil, do you want to ask your question, or has it been answered with the last part, Meghna?
Yeah, my question was, as a male, how, as in I've heard something about living the character as a writer or as an actor, but we are talking about writing here. So how can you get into the psyche of the opposite sex? So as a male, how can I say delve deep as it'll be fake and not ring true on some level? So yeah, that about sums up my question. Thank you.
I think the first thing you have to do is be a keen observer of people. And I always say that writers should have names but not faces. Like they should be in the background so they can keep observing people. Nowadays, of course, the dynamics have changed where writers unfortunately have to be in the public eye. But you have to keep observing. You have to keep listening. When, like I gave an example of a party, right? How do men and women interact with each other? How do they talk to one another? These small things in everyday life. Our biases that creep in, just observing them as a passive person, as an outsider. really help. Reading books with strong female characters, all the examples I gave you, watching movies with strong female characters. For example, Fleabag. I thought the reason a show like that works so well is because the main character was, she was so funny but also so flawed, and every decision she made was based on her personality, right? So because of her personality, she was diving into these situations which would not have happened to anybody else, and therefore the story was moving forward. But the conversations she was having were to the camera. So that really makes you understand how a woman's mind works. I'm just giving an example of, how to understand how the female mind works. But the best thing, apart from books, literature, cinema, web series, observation, is to just, as a creative person, put yourself in other people's shoes all the time. We are very empathetic human beings. And I think that's one thing as a humanity we anyway need. As human beings, we have to be empathetic, especially after what we've all gone through in the pandemic. I hope we're all more empathetic. But as a writer in particular, your EQ has to be extremely high. So, don't just observe, just absolve yourself of social interactions, and just kind of be an outsider in most situations. And trust me, all those little observations that you think will add to your character will just come to you. That's been my personal experience, at least.
Thank you, Meghna. I think we've come to the end of this wonderful masterclass. I mean, such interesting insights and such a short period of time. I think we've all learned so much. And this is not the first time we've done stuff with Meghna. I think it's probably our fourth or fifth, including at the actual Kala Ghoda Arts Festival a couple of years ago. And I'd like to thank Brinda and the Kala Ghoda Arts Association team for partnering with us again today. Brinda is here with us on this.
Hi, Brinda.
And also Penguin Random House for partnering with us. But thank you so much for spending your Saturday afternoon. I know these times are special, especially on the weekend. We have a host of very interesting programs coming up from Avid and Avid Online. The next session again is in partnership with the Kala Ghoda Association on Thursday, the centenary unveiling, the story of the majestic restoration of the CSMVS, the museum, followed by cultural capitals, where we look at the city of Varanasi. For more details, just stalk us on social media or check out our website. But thank you once again for joining us. Meghna and Brinda, I just urge you to stay for a few minutes. We just need one quick photo, and have a wonderful rest of the weekend. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, guys. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
For interesting session. We loved
If you
it.
need any insights, by the way, very quickly, you should read How to Get Published in India.
Thank you very
Which
much.
is the best. I keep forgetting to plug this book. But any workshop, always tell aspiring writers, this is a Bible, not because I've written it, but because everyone's told me so. People have got their books published thanks to this. And there's nothing else like that in the market. So pick up the book. Trust me, you'll save years of struggle, years of hard work, years of making mistakes that all of us made. And it's also got, apart from my tips, also got essays by Jeffrey Archer and Shobha De, Twinkle Khanna, all the top industry leaders, distributors, self-publishing platforms, all of that. So do yourself a favor, a solid, and pick up this book as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.